You're a hodgepodge too, so we're all kind of. I find it all the nation.
Yes. What's up?
Do you want me to?
Is that what time is it now?
11:20.
I think 12:30. Yeah, it'll just be a little short. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, thank you, everyone. And thank you to the CAT demonstration team and to Jason for kicking us off this morning. There's an hour between now and lunch, so we're the only ones standing in your way. Yesterday, we had a great panel discussion, so hopefully we can take some of that energy forward into what we'll discuss right now, which is around data integration, specifically the challenges and opportunities from our fantastic three panelists. They'll each speak for about 3 to 5 minutes following the format we did yesterday. But kind of reflecting more on their journey of using different types of data, their challenges, their opportunities, and potentially kind of maybe we can even extend this outward into the group today, into your own projects. So data integration, I think when we probably started this workshop, that was one of the really foundational elements that brought us together across different units. So specifically, just to reiterate, we're looking at integrating social data, health data, other forms of data with weather and climate across multiple scales, spatial and temporal. And more importantly, through really, really rich interdisciplinary collaborations that make some of this data integration, the technical aspect, just seemingly more possible, but also how we interpret and understand those kinds of results. So our panelists, as I mentioned, they'll speak about their own experiences. We haven't had too much time yet to discuss the challenges that have arisen through this workshop, but hopefully we can keep some of those insights in mind as we keep going for the rest of the week. So these are the questions that our panelists were tasked with answering. So you'll hear from each of them. What are your experiences with data integration? Even stepping back, maybe what is data integration? What does it mean to each of you? What are the main challenges that arise when integrating different forms of data at multiple scales? What have you seen others struggle with? How have you successfully addressed these challenges in your own work? And what other approaches to addressing them have you seen or heard? So in the interest of time, just because we have a little bit of a shorter time, I'll go through very briefly with a couple of introductions, and then we'll get started. Each of the panelists will have about 3 to 5 minutes. So first, Andrea Schumacher is a project scientist at NSF NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the Mesoscale and Microscale Meteorology Lab. Andrea holds a Master of Science in Atmospheric Science from Colorado State University and a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and Chemistry from the New College of Florida. She has extensive experience in developing and evaluating forecast products for tropical cyclones and has over a decade of experience partnering with social scientists and health scientists to explore vexing hazard society problems. Tyler Fricker is an assistant professor in the School of Sciences and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Louisiana Monroe. He's an environmental geographer and climatologist who focuses on applied climatology and human-environment interactions through the study of natural hazards using computational, statistical, and various geospatial methods. His research interests center around the environmental impacts of hazards on society and the connection between weather and climate. And much of this work bridges the gap between the climate change science side of things and the society-climate interaction. Tyler holds a doctorate and a master's degree from FSU, Florida State University Geography, and a bachelor's from The Ohio State University. And last, Matt Dunbar is a spatial research scientist and the assistant director of CSDE, and is also an affiliate professor in the Department of Geography here at the UW. Matt holds a PhD in geography from University of Kansas, and at CSDE, he supports the spatial analysis research needs for various center affiliates, which includes supporting with the collection, creation, storage, analysis, and management of spatial data, including very, very different types of data and analysis, ranging from mobile data, address matching, and spatial statistics and programming. So I'll turn it over to our 3 panelists, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sure you're looking forward to hearing from me more. I appreciate you all, giving me another chance to talk about this topic that's really, a big part of my passion for work in science. So, I have a background in meteorology and atmospheric science. I've spent a long time developing atmospheric models, trying to model impacts, using a lot of statistical methods to take these sort of big things we know about hurricanes and bring that down to the ground, the surface, and understand wind and rain and flooding. And then also connecting that data to public health data, social science data, et cetera. So first, I was just gonna start with data integration can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and I just wanted to find a definition. So I thought I would bring this up real quick. This is actually from IBM. I'll say I would add a lot to it, but they say data integration refers to the process of combining and harmonizing data from multiple sources into a unified, coherent format that can be put to use for various analytical, operational, and decision-making purposes. I think it's not bad. I think the word harmonizing is it's excellent in a way. It's not something I would expect to hear in this kind of a technical definition, but I think it encapsulates a lot of things that I think probably all of us have experienced in letting data work, trying to get data to work with each other. I'm going to focus a little bit on my role at NCAR in the Convergent Science program. We are trying to build those efforts, and one of the areas that I've been focusing on in that work over the last few months is data. Everything we do in these types of fields is data. It almost seems hard to remove data from the process and sort of treat it separately, because data is so integral to, I think, everything we do in this room. But the real focus, I think, as we start talking about the idea of convergence and this idea of deep integration across disciplines and deep integration of data is issues of developing frameworks for doing this, developing really good examples on how to integrate data, and also really coming up with frameworks for the ethics issues and privacy issues that we're going to see as we try to integrate social and meteorological data. I mean, there's certainly the technical aspects of taking atmospheric data is computed on grids, whatever is convenient for, or best for modeling, and then social data, health data, all of that is on these more geopolitical and human dimensions. That could be zip codes, census tracts, counties. And of course, trying to get those data sets to mesh is extremely difficult. But there's also all of these other ideas. And I guess what I wanted to sort of bring to this conversation, I guess, is I've been thinking about this more and more in the framework of storytelling. Every data has a complete story to it. It has not just who made it and how, but there's biases. There's the people who have used the data know more about the data sometimes than the people who created the data, because they found all the words and maybe that communication hasn't linked in. But the idea that passing data between disciplines, I don't want to say it should not be done, but it should be done with the utmost of care. Because just passing data without all of this background information is really hard. Or passing data with, I've seen the idea of reproducibility and replicability. You have like a card, like here's how the model was created and what platform, what system, and you turn that along with it, you pass that along with the data. But I would argue that it's so much more from my experience. Like a card would not be enough. I need to know, when is this data good? When is it bad? And I'll just leave you with one example from a paper we wrote in the AI realm on biases, is that some data sets have these quirks that no one would know about unless you were actually deep into the data. For example, some hurricane forecasting products, like where they document whether a hurricane has formed or not, a lot of that is reliant on satellite data, and at least previous to our current suite of satellites, we didn't have that data at night. We didn't have the visible data at night. Now we have sort of like proxies for it. And so it was much more likely that a tropical cyclone would be considered formed in the daylight hours because they would have that extra piece of information. You can find that pattern in the data, but that's something you might not know unless you know how forecasting works. And so, I just wanted to use that as an example of, there's all these this richness to data that you get from talking to other people, as opposed to, having a paper is nice, but ultimately, I think that as we move forward with data integration, a lot of that is integration of people. So, I'm sorry, that's a long.
Yeah, I'll be a little more succinct, I think, which just so you guys have time, because I didn't do it like that.
No.
But when I think of data integration, she nailed it. It is certainly finding this harmony. I think of it as almost like finding a synergy between different either data sources or data models, and finding ways to use that data to create the knowledge, to create the information that then we're able to put out into the world. And I think the challenges that I've seen working both with the physical science, the atmospheric scientists, meteorologists, but also the social scientists, is that often our epistemologies are different. So at its core, the way in which we look at truth and science is a bit different. And so the way in which we try to make sense of that science or that sense of that data can be from two different places. And if those things aren't aligned, or at least they're not talked about openly, we can have inferences from one side or the other that don't really mesh with each other. And so from an epistemological side of things, I find that challenging, but also just from a measurement standpoint, the way in which we do it, as Andrea mentioned, the physical scientists are environmentally, from an atmospheric perspective, we are grid-based, so we're going to be using that raster data, at least at the core of how we get that data. And in the social sciences, especially if we're going to bring in socioeconomic demographic information, that typically has some form of political boundary attached to it at different levels and different scales. And so finding the match between the two is difficult, not only from the structure of the data, but from trying to create as little bias or as little uncertainty as possible. And so trying to close those gaps, and there are different methods to do so, but to try to close those gaps often get us to, maybe the way I look at it, is like the most complete lowercase t truth that we can get out of our work. So in my experience, often thinking about this in terms of severe convective weather, if I'm asking questions about climatology, I certainly want information about the environment that's going to come in a raster data set. So the way in which I predict cases across space, or thinking about population bias in those cases across space, I'm going to have to figure out a way to either rasterize or work through my socioeconomic or political side of things to then build into how I would expect that natural variation to exist because of the physical variables. On the opposite side of things, if I'm trying to predict or work with impacts, that could be economic or human-based impacts, what I'm going to have to do is figure out a way to ensure that for me, it's usually tornadoes. We're given at least some geospatial information at a vector level. And so figuring out ways to harness the vector in that raster data to get me an idea of how strong a tornado was, or what variables were attached with it atmospherically, and then adding in the additional variables that I can get at that individual tornado level, and ensuring that the inferences that I make from my modeling approaches are just at that level, right? That individual tornado level is the level of analysis. It doesn't apply to just general space, right? So this way in which we talk about our results through data integration is often pretty vital as well. So we don't make a misconception about that data. So ways in which I think about it.
Awesome, thank you. I don't have much to say, right? I don't know. This is great. I'm gonna just try and keep it short also, maybe more introduce myself and background. So hopefully that helps facilitate the discussion here in just a second. I really liked your lead off. It's kind of more the direction I'm gonna go in. I'll start with what I would take a definition for data integration, kind of more given my very background. I really see it as a kind of the data facilitates a thing, which is problem solving across knowledge or disciplinary domains, and how you make that happen is not as much about the engineering piece, it's about the understanding piece between those. So my background's a little wackadoodle and curvy, but it's led to a fun career. So I started as a computer engineer, like building the things, not just writing the code. So I didn't want to be an engineer, got into environmental studies, park ranger for a few years, and found geography, which is the best discipline the whole time, right?
It is, yeah.
So In Kansas, we had a cool program that had both like the human cultural, the physical, as well as the technical, the GIS remote sensing piece. So I kind of got a nice integration across all of those. And then I spent the last 15 years working at CSDE at a demography research center with like 150 faculty affiliates all over the place. So facilitating research in all these different domains has been a lot of fun. And those have varied from like mapping landmine fields, like primary data collection out in the field, GPS, where certainty and uncertainty are really important in a very, pertinent way. Working with HIV researchers here at the University of Washington, the Global Health Department, in checking drug user clinics in Kenya. So seeing things on the ground and how you do unique patient identification, medical records, and tracking migration across varied systems, hospital record systems outside of this country are a whole nother thing to get into. And then my most recent gig has been studying dogs. So I got involved in this project called the Dog Aging Study, which the goal was to enroll about 10,000 dogs, canine companion animals, and look at aging in dogs because people love talking about their dogs. Dogs age and unfortunately die, but within the lifespan of a researcher. So we can collect data, track that, and then actually look at health outcomes at scale. Unfortunately, the project's up to 50,000 people now, and I'm in charge of the data collection, management, integration, harmonization, putting that out there. So for me, I think what I bring to the panel is less about the data and engineering side and more about kind of the project management and meeting theoretical and scientific objectives. That's what I see the integration needs to be about. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So right now we'll open it up to questions, specific and broad, covering any facet of data integration. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about how thinking about aggregating environmental data. Usually social data because migration exists at the county level, maybe tracked or like a demographic and health survey cluster. And often how researchers will work with that is doing spatial means. But we know there can be quite a lot of variation, for example, with temperature representation within that spatial unit. So how should we be thinking about aggregation? Should we be accounting for variation, or is mean really fine?
I guess the question is, once you have your data, what type of methodologies are you applying to make sense of that data, right? Because if it's regression based, so then you'll be taking means of means, which can be challenging, but might also be captured in that regression. So it might be safe from that perspective. If you're going more specific in terms of the scale, then you might want to bridge out and think about the spacing, where you're getting that data from. Is it from a weather station? Is it from, satellite imagery? Because that's going to help make sense of how you could either, increase the spatial resolution of that grid that you're working on, or at least tell you a bit more about that uncertainty that you're building into that framework.
I would just give the standard academic response that it depends. Like a few of my tips and tricks were you really have to figure out what's the point of the integration piece to answer your question in the best way, just even temperatures. We were talking about yesterday, we bring temperatures in for all these dogs across the country. Some scientists want the mean that we're just counting. Some wanted the variability, the difference between min and max. Some wanted the highs, some wanted the lows. It really just depended on that, the outcomes and scientific objectives. So we try and kind of ascertain what the broadest scale of questions that could be and incorporate those when producing data products.
Can I add one thing to that? I think one other, and this is something that we've dealt in some of our own work, is taking that as an opportunity to test the stability of different measures of central tendency. So if you build 3 or 4 different models using different ways of actually aggregating your data, then you can kind of decide, not based on the empirics, but stepping back, as the 3 panelists have said, thinking about the theory, what makes the most sense, or even presenting all 3 as a measure of robustness for the actual work you're doing.
You get another publication out of it.
Yeah.
So your background is so fascinating, Matt, and well, everybody's is, but I know Andrea and Tyler, so yours is new to me. A couple of questions actually that intertwined. So, given that you worked across those different problem spaces, landmines, HIV, dog aging, kind of what is your experience about how long it took you to feel like you had enough knowledge to work effectively in those spaces? And then kind of related to that, like you said, you're kind of on the data management kind of coordination side. Is there a best practice or one or two key ones in terms of how you're facilitating, presumably, people who are working as part of the team with very different backgrounds
Yeah.
on the kind of data integration problem?
Yeah, so the first one's a good question because I still feel like a complete faker. I mean, that's part of being an academic, right? You're always like stepping into new domains and trying to figure out when you should open your mouth or not. But I think my answer to that is like, you know, very quickly realize when you're hitting your wall in terms of what you've got. And one of my other tips was like, just bring together domain experts up front, kind of to your point earlier, you can't just expect. I know how to deal with data, so of course I can just read the code book or read the. So I think that's been one of the biggest things to accelerate that process is as soon as you realize that there's a missing link, bring those people in and don't try to do it yourself. Could you restate your second question so I have a chance to think about it? For a second?
Just if you had a recommendation of a best practice or two, which I think maybe is also embedded in the questions of Samir and others, in terms of facilitating this kind of team science with people from with really diverse expertise working on these problems, but maybe with a lens toward data integration.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask lots of stupid questions. Yeah, so I didn't have project manager as a word in my domain like 10 years ago, and I've been working on large enough projects that they are all of a sudden like the only thing that really makes these projects work. You've got really brilliant scientists, really smart engineers, but you don't have somebody to help kind of facilitate the crosstalk, none of that works. So yeah, when you're sitting down and having those conversations, I think it's very easy to tell, especially when you got really bright minds and big egos in the rooms and people just assume that each other knows what each other's saying or thinking. Being the one that's comfortable saying, like, could you clarify that? Because I don't get it. Everybody else probably does. That's why it's stupid one.
Yeah, so Andrew brought up ethics, so I want to talk about it. And I know some examples were already given of like Tyler, you were talking about like trying not to make generalizations when you're focusing on like one specific event or talking about like asking other experts about what their data means. But I was wondering if you can give very concrete examples of some of your experiences dealing with ethical dilemmas within the data integration space. So like people have an idea of, if you've never done data integration, like what are some like roadblocks that you might run into when it comes to those ethical considerations?
So I'm gonna bring up actually one that we just talked about, with this current project. It's more of an on the horizon ethics question, and that's with personal cell phone data. As we look at the different providers, a lot of them provide aggregate data, which is already, you know, I'm using de-anonymized again, I'm undoing anonymized. You know, ultimately, we're looking more towards the vendor that provides us with actual cell phone locations. And theoretically, you can take that and you can see people going back and forth from home to work, and you could theoretically pull out personally identifiable information. So this is honestly a huge ethical concern for us as we start to work with that data and integrate it with our survey data, which is also, although it's anonymized, it's still personal information. So I think that this is something that's hard coming from the atmospheric scientist realm, because like the idea of data being sensitive is not completely foreign, but not something they think about right away. And so, right, so ethically, I think that a lot of the ethics involve, right, whether or not the data has personal information, whether you're respecting data sovereignty is another issue that's come up a lot. A lot of data sets are collected from people and in ways that may not be ethical. And it's really important that we really assess those facts of the data and be sure to credit the people who are actually providing this data and that the information is going back to them. So these are all key issues that I think it's easy to gloss over when you're coming from a space of working with gridded precipitation data. And you're like, oh, I just want to connect it to where people are, right? No big deal. But you almost have to default always to the most sensitive piece of data and sort of go from there. So
Yeah, my experience, I mean, the closest I've gotten from an ethical perspective is usually the inference, or at least how I'm expressing my results. So if I'm talking about casualties or building out modeling frameworks for casualties, often in hazards, of course, we think of minority populations as being, more vulnerable and as a result, a higher propensity or risk of being a casualty in an event. And so when I'm building out these models, I could add in a lot of variables. I could add in race as a variable in my model. And in fact, have done so at times, but when I've shown this to or worked with more physical scientists, trying to connect the two, far too often, what I'll notice is that the physical scientists, for no fault of their own, but they see race as a physical variable rather than a social variable. And so their expression of what they're seeing is that the blacker and browner communities, higher number of casualties, but they're thinking about that as a body problem rather than the social problem. And so if the question is, are we gonna build interventions to reduce those impacts? We can't look at these things as bodies, as physical variables, even though they're countable and these kind of things. And so the ethics of, do we pump that into a model just because we can? And so for me, I kind of backtracked on data-driven modeling approaches, which I know AI, ML, but more theory-driven models, right? But at the core of my work, can I trust, what's going in and then giving me an outcome that is going to allow me to make those interventions. So I think that's for me, often the ethics is like, am I understanding the problem completely? Or am I thinking I'm understanding the problem?
Yeah, and just being, able to speak up when you see that going on as, as the data person on the project. Be like, hey, there's lab, this somewhat tangential, but I think getting to the point, had a really brilliant PhD lab science biologist type on this dog project that had, I think, probably just learned principal component analysis and was like, applied this to everything. And was just looking at health outcomes in the dogs, but related to the owners, we geocode them and link them to 10 or 20, neighborhood demographic characteristics. And basically her principal component analysis, she came back with her top 3. She had reinvented sociology and human geography. It's like, oh my gosh, I figured out that it's in dogs, but it's still very similar, right, to humans, which dogs are. And so, being kind, but also being like, there's a whole discipline there. You can't just run with that paper. Her advisor's in the room who's like, oh, this is amazing. We've discovered all this. And it's just like, slowing the roll down a little bit, but it happened.
Yeah. So I really appreciate this discussion. So in a lot of ways, it's like the four of you are sort of reflecting on what the research community's obligations are. And so to push you a little bit further and to bring in some of the language of counterfactuals, when is data integration, when should we focus on data disintegration, or when should we do data integration? What are the parameters there, any that you've thought about? And part of this is like, you're getting at sort of the, uses in the social sciences, the unexpected, unanticipated consequences of things. And so I'd love to just hear you all brainstorm on that.
Yeah, it's a funny question. I want to do it justice.
Can I add to it?
Of course.
Which buy you a little time.
Yeah.
So I think it was maybe similarly along the lines that I was feeling grateful for a group of folks who are coming from different disciplinary orientations. And yet also acknowledging the limits of our own disciplinary orientation. And so thinking about data integration, what might the possible implications be for the research team who is doing the data integration?
Sure.
So, I'll abandon my responsibilities for the moment. So when I think about data integration, one of the first things I think about is, this may not apply to every case of it, but whenever you're talking about integration, you still maybe maintaining a centrality around a specific form of data. So in other words, you're integrating something into something else, right? So you can think of many different circumstances where that might be problematic and reinforce huge power disparities in terms of how people use and access data. Probably the clearest one is a lot of discussions around integrating indigenous knowledge into Western science, right? So what are you doing when you're actually doing that, right? You're completely undermining a completely different way of knowing and governing the world that is fully distinct in many ways from Western science. And not just, data as a technical artifact, but data as a way of governing and living. So I think that's one case where data integration can actually do us a major disservice, not only in terms of clouding how we understand the mixture of this sorts of data, but also has a really clear role in power.
I'll sort of follow on with that. I think intentionality is just so key. We can integrate all kinds of data and we can make best choices for how to do it, but ultimately, we're doing the integration for a purpose. There may always be unintended consequences of that. If there could always be people who come, especially if you are keeping your integrated data sets public, who could come in and potentially use that integrated data in ways you didn't intend. But just in my experience in integrating data, it's always around some sort of driving research that we want to do that is, first of all, ethically vetted within the interdisciplinary team. And then that helps drive the data integration in a way that, we could potentially use that data to answer our questions. But, as a standalone piece, I'm not sure. I think that's a really interesting, actually, like an element here too, of the sharing of integrated data and how much we should be doing that and how careful we should be about putting data sets out there that are maybe open to being interpreted in ways that we didn't intend. But intentionality overall, I think is sort of the high mark. And I can say that we've spent a lot of time in our group in the CAT project just vetting data sets and trying to figure out how to put those together. And, integration, the actual physical putting the data together is going to be the last piece. It should be hard. It should be complicated. People in the team should feel free to argue with each other. And that's where I think that also it would be great to have more guidelines on this too. I think this is becoming more and more popular, and I think that there's a lot of ethical guidelines that could sort of be laid out into a framework of best practices. So I don't know what the right group is to do that, but it feels like it's the time to really start putting that out there as well, and creating some sort of rules of engagement for integration.
Yeah, I wonder if we're a bad sub-populace to be thinking about disintegration. Well, I just think because so much of us inherently are approaching our problems through a lens of interdisciplinary transdisciplinary convergent science, that I would think most of us appreciate what that means, and how we define it. But given federal initiatives and things that happen, I mean, there's certainly, I'll see more and more, human aspects in NASA calls than I've ever seen. And so that's gonna bring in a population of researchers who are seeing it as a dollar amount that they can add to, their tenure case or whatever, but perhaps not appreciate what it means to be either convergent or transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary at its core. And so what they'll think is, well, I have my way of understanding the world in that physical realm. I can grab census data, or I can grab this, like I'll just figure out how to make sense of that and I'll tell the story from that. And so that to me is where the disintegration would actually be more about. It would say, how do we find ways to ensure, and maybe it's already happening in the selection of what's being funded, but how are we ensuring that those groups are actually working towards that, a proper integration, rather than just because we have it, we shouldn't use it, right? So I think that, again, maybe not the best sub-populace, or the best sub-populace to think about it, but maybe not. Yeah.
I'll just throw on one of the things that I had jotted down earlier, it's kind of relevant. But I think starting from a point of keeping it as simple as possible is a guiding principle, especially as we're getting into the, you can throw it all in, see what comes out of it, let's just give it a go. I think that that's a really healthy way to start as a covering people please, or just saying no as a starting point in these discussions when something new comes up is okay. I just saw genome-wide association from a PhD student that just threw, analysis, we've got sequences on these dogs. They threw everything in there and just to see, is there any relationship? And one of the low relationship was number of dog walks per week. So they're looking for something in the dog's genetics, because it was a variable that was in the data set we gave them. They just threw everything in there and was like, that doesn't mean anything. But because it's there, we'll give it a go.
Yeah, Sarah and then Masha and then DJ. All right, Masha.
So I have a question about integrating qualitative data. So I think for a lot of the problems that we're talking about, like which neighborhoods experience more extreme heat, you could just go to those neighborhoods and ask people and they might be able to tell you. Obviously, that's, anecdotal and you would have to do interviews. But so there's a lot of value in people's experiences and just asking them questions instead of running the data and say, oh, we learned this thing that you already know. But on the other hand, obviously you can't scale that up. It takes so much more effort to interview people than it does to collect their data. So how do you sort of balance that? Have you ever seen a successful case of integrating qualitative data into quantitative data sets? How do you approach that?
That's a cool question, especially because even if you have both, the perception of the thing is more likely to predict behavior if that's an outcome than the actual thing. Temperature is a great example. Do you think it's hot? And hot's relative.
I mean, and from that perspective, from our survey data, we asked people if they thought they were in like a hurricane warning, and we have their zip codes. We could literally see if they were in hurricane warning. And so we are sort of at this crossroads of what, maybe we use both in terms of, try modeling with both of those in terms of covariates and other things, but I think integration also sort of our immediate thought is maybe making an Excel spreadsheet and adding a column and putting that data there. And of course, qualitative data literally doesn't fit inside the box. So I think we just have to sort of expand our idea of integration. And I think I haven't personally worked with qualitative data a lot, so I should probably be careful here, but I've seen so many people work with mixed methods in such wonderful ways. But once again, it just takes this intentionality. And I have not seen it in the case for the qualitative gets quantified, like, I think we have to kind of, that's sort of maybe our first leaning, but we don't want to take this qualitative data and just degrade it almost into numbers. So, but that integration, I guess I would call it integration, but it sort of takes a different form. It's really just part of the research.
Yeah, I've seen comparative where, it'll be risk perception or an idea of what's happening at the surface that will be evaluated in through its own methodology. And then it'll be compared to, a physical modeling approach, right? And so then you're able to make the comparisons across the two. The true integration though, figuring out that qualitative work, how it would fit into whether it's our MLs or AI, I think that's the challenge. Like, I think that's the hardest part, and the question isn't just can we do it, it's should we do it? Or are we potentially gonna be inferring things that are not appropriate, right? Or we're gonna be inferring things that then create policies or intervention strategies, and then, oh, that didn't work. Well, it didn't work not because the method wasn't correct or the way in which we proxied it wasn't correct, but because, the outcome that we got actually wasn't really kind of back to that original, whether it's folk science or whether these things that you just can't easily, put into, whether it's a number or matrix or indices, whatever it is we're trying to build out. So more comparative than true integration.
Yeah. Nice to add one thing to that. So I think also thinking about what successful means in your own context is super important. So as everyone was speaking, I was thinking about, qualitative data can help you specify a model, right? Instead of more junk models, we're just throwing everything in, seeing what's sticking. It can help us interpret it with context without losing meaning to those. It can also help us being a little bit more humble in how we interpret those results. And I also think there's also a procedural aspect to it as well, where it goes back to the previous question around integrating different forms of data and what is the consequence of different forms of knowledge. One of the things that screams success to me is how do you maintain these as equally valid sources even while you're mixing and integrating them? There's so much AI and
Yeah.
Sarah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I really wanted to compliment everybody, it was fantastic, you know. And this is a commentary, a little bit, just a bit of a comment from Martha. One way to think about qualitative too is that you know, science is sort of, we keep investigating, we go around the scientific circle, wheel of science. And qualitative fits at any stage of the process. And there's a wonderful book by, Phil Axon and Lisa Pierce about a longitudinal study that takes place in Nepal, in which they've integrated and brought in qualitative data at every stage of the scientific discovery process. So they've done it in terms of designing survey instruments, you know, initially qualitative work to do that. They've used qualitative work to do what Samira was just saying, you know, how do we understand what these relationships are that we're finding in the quantitative data? What exactly are we inferring? Can we uncover some causal mechanisms? And they've also used it to understand better outliers in their data. And so they've integrated qualitative information along the way, recognizing the complementarity of the two pieces, and absolutely essential components of each in research projects. So, I think it's really great. I highly recommend it. Accident years it was a long time ago, but it's still a very relevant book. The other thing I wanted to ask I really loved this conversation and I appreciate it. I wondered if you might reflect on the balance. And so what I'm hearing is that the balance of work around this idea of integration is that there's a lot of upfront work to doing integration. And so often our research funding, our research, you know, timescales are really de-emphasize that upfront work. And we plan for doing the paper writing and the analysis, and we don't really plan for that upfront work. And when you write a grant, and you know, many people in here are used to writing grants, it's very hard to justify that upfront work because we don't have we don't have a body of knowledge around what you have to do, what it's gonna take to integrate the data and all the things that you're gonna have to do, and you can't there's nothing to give you that guidance so that a review committee can understand why you're gonna spend so much time on that and why you're gonna do X, Y, Z why you have to do X, Y, Z steps in an integration project. And just sort of a call out there to maybe we need to have like a body of knowledge that says why and explains and justifies and helps provide guidance, just like we had a body of knowledge around the ethics of including diverse samples in our data collection, or we have a whole lot around the ethics of protecting data. But we haven't really talked about these other larger research components that everybody talks about, and recognizes and is so essential to doing this team science at this intersection. So that was just like a call out that we need this kind of work done.
Sarah, can you send that recommendation, that book
Yeah,
into the Slack?
Yeah.
I want to just piggyback on what Sarah just said, because she's absolutely, I totally agree, particularly when you're doing interdisciplinary science, when the gap between the physical and social sciences is so big. All of this stuff of the preliminaries include learning enough about each other's concepts, methodology, interpretive frameworks is like all part of that preparatory work to writing a strong proposal that will get funded. And I really appreciated what you said, Matt, about having a project manager who is often almost like that liaison between the sciences, who can ask the stupid questions that everybody else feels like they've got too much ego on the line to ask. I think that was just amazingly insightful for me, because I think too often when I've engaged in interdisciplinary proposal writing, people say, oh, we'll get a postdoc or a graduate student to be a project manager. Because they think of it as being like a scheduling and like task management kind of role. But I really like what you said, because that person actually has a very important liaison function that might not be fully appreciated. And I would also say that I'm seeing some really excellent books about interdisciplinary research that have come out recently where they talk about exactly that problem. Including an article about the fourth National Climate Assessment, where some anthropologists from the EPA did a study of the chapters, the writing of the chapters, and they interviewed people about interdisciplinary conversations and what went right and what went wrong, and particularly focusing on what physical scientists thought about social scientists. So it's super interesting. So, I will find that and put it into, I'll send it to you.
Okay, good put it in Slack, yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Then I can make one more pitch for the Lori Peak paper on convergence, because this
Oh, yeah.
is also something that really comes out of that work. And I thank you, Sarah, because as we're developing this convergence program, we're trying to talk about funding, and, you know, that's not there. Funding isn't there to integrate and deeply come up with research questions. The idea is you're supposed to work together to come up with your research questions, which includes broadening your question space at first, and who pays for that time, because it's really important. But you're right, you can't write a proposal unless you have sort of an outcome already in mind. So.
Yeah. I had a couple questions and kind of thinking through the process of like how we go about the integration, the integration process. So one thing I'm curious from the panel is like, what, for some of the projects you work on, what has led you to seek, like what's the point where you're like, I need a AI person to come in on this project, or I need a demographer, right? But like to reach out to these other disciplines, what is driving your desire to do that? And then I think another related question is, what's the most effective way of finding people? Because for these data integration challenges, because like for things like hackathons and contests and benchmark kind of stuff, it's sort of, I was coming from the ML world, there's a lot of like, we'll put this data set out there and let anyone who has a ML model go train on it, but that's usually not how, like, I don't think there's the equivalent of a social science contest where you have a bunch of random social scientists go out and all submit surveys to, which, I mean, maybe there's some version of it that might be kind of interesting but the kind of like, is this all personal relationships? Are there other, like, people who aren't like of the community and have those relationships, are we missing out on finding people who might be better collaborators?
I mean, the short answer is yeah, of course, we are probably missing out on some of the best to help. I would say from my experience, it's kind of twofold. One is like within my discipline, so geography being so broad, I've engaged in a little bit of what I would claim, and others probably as well, as critical physical geography, which is combined both our critical human geographers with our physical geographers. And so inherently, right, you're building out that social theoretical framework from the critical human side, and you're applying it to some question that's rooted more in the physical sciences, across space. And that I was lucky enough to have someone that graduated with me at Florida State who went on and had his, his own career. And so we were able to come back together and work on a paper on casualties in Shreveport and a place-based analysis. So I was saying, instead of thinking about this stuff across general space, let's think about a specific town and kind of the histories, the shared histories that exist in that place that might be determining outcomes that we see in these events. And what I quickly realized was just how much time his side of things was going to take, because the grounding of that analysis wasn't just, let me grab this quantitative data quickly and analyze it across space, because I can do that in a weekend, right, or 2 weekends. But his was diving into old newspaper articles, right? We were going back into the history of plantations in that area, right? Things that aren't easily, done or just quickly done. And so I think far too often what will happen is, as we try to find these connections, we just, we'll reach out and, of course, we hope someone will be hooked, but the reality is that they have their own studies as well. They have their own things that they're interested in. Often in the social sciences on that qualitative side, it's time consuming. And so the amount of work it would take to kind of reorient themselves into these problems, we can take for granted as more of that quantitative or physical side of the equation. And we just assume they want to meet us in the middle, but that meeting in the middle isn't the same time component. It's not the same energy component. And so, we should expect a lot of no's because there is this challenge. And then the other thing that I've realized is trying to build off of that, I've tried to work and have some collaborations with people at Grambling, historically Black college in North Louisiana, and trying to think about some of the challenges for those populations and hazards across time. But again, their workload is so much heavier than my workload is. And so again, my thought process of, they'll want to be involved in this. They can take the lead in this, which is what should be happening anyway for someone like me. They just don't have the space. And so again, you think of these collaborations as like the optimal collaborations, and the reality is that the foundations are not the same. The grounding's not the same. And so we can't expect it to kind of work out the way our brain works.
I can speak from being an atmospheric scientist, desperately wanting to work with social scientists in all kinds of different fields. I definitely tried cold calling a lot, like people who seem to work in the right area, say, can I come to your office and we'll chat? And honestly, that never ever got me anywhere, would actually, and I can see why, now if someone cold called me, that might be, because we're just all busy, but the best successes I've had is going to these interdisciplinary talks, going to other departments' talks on like somebody who's doing agricultural work, but they have a hurricane component, something that I know about. And then a lot of the time I'll see something where I could help and going and offering like, hey, that's maybe not the best model. Like we've actually updated that model and I could help you, or I could help you find that data. And those are the connections that have actually lasted for me. So just for maybe that's not generalizable, but my personal experience is super relational. People aren't just sitting there. Most people aren't just sitting there waiting to work with other people. It's a hardship to initiate a new partnership with somebody outside of your discipline because it takes more time and energy. But you have to break the ice in some way other than just like, hi, my name's Andrea. And sometimes, like showing that interest in their work and helping them make their work better is kind of that piece that's worked for me, but.
Yeah, awesome. Same. I was just gonna sound like a cheesy sales pitch, but find integrative research centers like Science Institute, the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. I think those are really wonderful opportunities, and people like Anne or Sarah who just seem to lose this like team building spirit, and they just constantly are keeping track of everyone in their spheres and what they're working on and draw those connections together. But I think finding those centers, getting involved in them too, you're right, you can't just sit back, you have to go to the seminars, start meeting people, but those are great opportunities where you have pre-existing bodies that bring together people together.
Yeah, John. I don't think I would have asked this question at the beginning, but given the way this discussion has moved, it's been really interesting that you got into the epistemic issues and domain, respective domains. So, the data integration we're talking about here is about creating that unique idea and the challenges that you all have. Have any of you had experience or trying to pursue knowledge graphs as either a complementary route or an alternate route for data integration, right? Which is a much different way of integrating data, but it respects sort of the semantic understandings of each of the sets of data and maintains some respect, but still shows how the data is related in some way, right? How those, at least the entities within the data are, so, yeah.
I'm just gonna be the person who's asking a stupid question. What did you say? Have any of you done?
Oh, knowledge graphs or knowledge modeling.
Thank you.
As
said
an
graphs.
alternative or, yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I have a question. So I'll throw that out there, and see.
I don't have experience with it, so comment too much on it.
John, can you get fined?
I can't really, I'm still working on stuff. And we are, what the program is funding a workshop in the spring, so I'll hold off on any answers of my. But basically, you know, you are modeling a domain of phenomena. So let's say weather, and you've got storms and you've got sensors and you've got observations. And so you define them, you create an ontology of that sort of phenomena. And then you're able to assign data sets to each one of those. But you've also then set up the relationships between the sensors, the observations, and the storm events that occurred at or measured by. And so you created this relationship between these data sets and entities and nodes. And then you can interrogate it, usually, you know, once you put it into a graph database, so that you're setting up the relationships. You can interrogate that semantic web with Sparkle or some other NoSQL language, but you can also, what I'm exploring is putting a chatbot on top of it, so it'll do that sort of thing. But then you're asking some questions of the relationships between the data based on the ontologies that you've set up.
That's cool. I can firmly answer, no, I've never done that before. Where have knowledge graphs been my whole career? Nice to meet you. Thanks.
I know that, I know NIH is doing this a bit in the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research, to try to come up with integrated semantic ontological databases, especially in the social science, in behavioral and social sciences, where there are so many different ways in which people measure, phenomena. And so they're trying to kind of come up with some way to rationalize, measurement and relationships. I think it's very hard, but there's, I know that there are people working on it. I haven't worked on it at all. I'm a little bit skeptical. Yeah. That's, I guess I come at it.
I'm meditating that too, whether it's like another trend that's happening, but it's worth exploring, but I just want to see if any.
I don't think it's a buzzword because people have been trying to work on this for a long time. And it's just kind of coming of age where it's becoming possible to actually do it. I don't know that we're there yet where it's fully possible to do these things, but I think that, you know, we're on a trajectory to get there.
Right. I have one other thing, kind of piggybacking on what Sarah said earlier and what you just mentioned, that thinking a little bit bigger and a little bit more like long-term, not only convincing the funding and the scientific community, the time and effort required to do the data integration, but also at some point in time, having some sort of a a la carte menu for all that you can, at least within each of these domains. If you're going through the work to make the graphs, why not make it something that can be added to and sustained in public knowledge? So that instead of reinventing the wheel, you can know within a domain, what are the, you know, de facto standards that have been agreed upon over time, like the 5-star Yelp reviews or whatever, eventually in the data world would seem to be worthwhile.
And those exist, so, schema.org, schema on science, so there's some community ontologies that are out there in public that you would want to draw on as you're doing sorts of.
As a starting point, okay.
Yeah, cool.
Can you share that in the Slack?
What?
Can you share those links in the Slack?
Sure.
Gus.
Yeah, and this concern might be a little long, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like moving forward for integrations where like a data set that we assumed is really consistent and will be invested in will, like, you know, lose that investment either from the federal government, things like that. And then how to safeguard whether that's like with a replacement or alternative, and kind of risks to vulnerable data sets.
Yeah, that's a real concern. Yeah, I would say especially we're in an election year that there are competing outlooks on what that might look like federally moving forward in terms of the things that we use for those data sets. So, I look at it as twofold. One way is like, we think about it maybe going down, like, we feel like, you know, losing some integrity. The other option, and what I've noticed, and so the US Census Bureau is gonna, at least moving forward, going to start putting out their releases are saying they're gonna start putting out gridded data sets. So instead of just thinking about them at our traditional political boundaries, now they're gonna have gridded, so we don't have to go through CDEC and the dosimetric mapping techniques and ways in which we've gotten those things at grid levels now. We're just gonna, that's gonna be built into the estimates that we get moving forward. So that's a real positive. The other side of things is if you there's disinvestment in this, side of things, well, now we are gonna have bigger gaps. And so, we would expect that those, underserved communities or marginalized communities are only going to be less served in the data sets that we look at. And so we really don't know that until that, year comes out or whatever, or every 5 years comes out. But, I think it just comes down to uncertainty and.
Yeah, I think that goes along with knowing the story of your data
Yeah.
too. I've been on projects where built a whole model, integrating a bunch of, basically a model of models. So you're integrating a bunch of hurricane data from different models to create sort of a new model. And as soon as it was operational, one of those models was discontinued. And, I'm gonna put the onus on myself too, as a person in that research group. We should have been more on the pulse of every single bit of data that we were integrating and what the future of that was. And so, it happens, data drops out, Twitter. It's a great example, a lot of longitude, right? And they took out all discounts really for research. They were giving researchers discounts to do some really interesting work. And suddenly the tap is off and Twitter's very different now than or X is different than Twitter was a couple of years ago. So, a lot of stuff you can't control, but what you can control is just doing your best to stay on the pulse of your data sets and know their stories and who's responsible
Or
for their
disclosing
fate.
limitations. I mean,
That
it's
too.
fine to disclose limitations, right? And science is always about building on itself. So if you're limited by Facebook data that's 5 years old, well, as long as you're grounding it in that and it's not assuming that it's a predictive, measure moving forward, then I think it's a fair way to provide analysis. It's just a matter of, being honest about the data that you're having, the questions that you're asking.
So we have time for maybe one more question, two more questions. And did you have a question? I saw your hand.
Yeah, I forgot it.
Come back.
I guess we'd say something about ontology, the whole idea of knowledge graphs. Because I've worked on mental models my whole career, and there's a lot of work on mental models that comes from different perspectives. But one of the things that struck me over time is how our understanding of the differences in the structure of people's knowledge has increased over time. We know a lot more about expertise and how experts think differently than people who have not worked in a specific domain, how domain specific that expertise is and how that matters in terms of how people think about a problem. And so, any one specific ontology, the schema.org said community ontologies, which community is that? And so it's going to be prescriptive in a way if people take it as, or normative in a way that might not be desirable from an ethical perspective. So it's worthwhile sort of thinking back about what this trend might mean for how people are thinking about the structure of knowledge. And I, just to go back to Gus's question and tie it in with that, I was just thinking about what Andrea said about, and all of you said about the ethics of thinking about where data are coming from, the sources of the data, and the issues of how people sometimes trespass on other people's data unintentionally. And there is this big question when you're collecting data, how much attention you pay to what I call metadata, which are all the stories behind the data, where they come from, what they're about. And the more cautious you can be about thinking about that holistically, the better equipped you'll be to think about the differences between that data set and some new data set that replaced it when that data set comes in. And so you might be better equipped to try to think about how to bridge those gaps. So it's hard work, but I don't know, I think that's something that we're still working on, is what kind of metadata do we need? And there are ethical dimensions of that, as well as sort of pragmatic dimensions of that, like space and time.
One last question, Julie.
And I'm sort of hesitant to ask it because it's a little muddled in my mind. But I feel like, maybe especially with Masha's question about plot and fall, that we started, and what I heard was almost like talking about not just data integration, but knowledge integration. And I guess I wondered if conceptually there's value in distinguishing these two ideas. I mean, if it's important to think through pros and cons and challenges and approaches of, for a lack of better way of thinking about it, like putting, like Andrew was saying, like somehow, like truly putting pieces of information, bits of information together to do true data integration. That is somehow, I don't even want to say co-occurring, that's not the right word, because it doesn't have to necessarily co-occur in space and time, but that versus maybe more of a sequential or iterative process where we're doing more knowledge integration, like what I heard a little bit when we were talking about quant and qual, right? That we're sense making, but we're not truly integrating the data in the same way. And I guess I'm just almost having this conceptual explication conversation in my own brain about, I imagine that if you have a Venn diagram that they overlap, but they're not equivalent constructs. And I just wondered if we need to be thinking about these things kind of differently, or just maybe be cognizant when we're maybe thinking more in the knowledge integration space versus the true data integration space, because there's pros and cons and challenges and approaches that are different. So it's not, so maybe it's a comment, a thought, and a question as to whether or not it's useful to sort of distinguish these concepts. Or just be mindful about this.
I mean, I think so. I think the Venn diagram, there's lots of overlap, but there's plenty of distinguishing factors. You don't have to get knowledge in the same format to make it tough, you know, or read it into the same software. And so, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, like we're on this, we're just like getting excited. I mean, Masha, when you asked your question, that was the first thing that I thought of, was it's iterative. They both feed on one another, and Sarah kind of said the same thing. I mean, you can Venn diagram, right? You can do one without the other, but that's not very fun. Like the fun is in the middle, but you can't just focus on one or the other. You kind of have to go do a thing and then come back. Is you can come up with an idea for what you're trying to do, go and look at the data, and then that, okay, no, we got to go back. Or you can go out and do some surveys or some, you know, interviews, which then inform your surveys. You gather data at mass. Oh, we need to do this.
But do we even call that data integration, or is it knowledge integration? And again, so like, and maybe it's I don't think it's a semantic argument. I actually do think there are conceptual differences that are important. So, yeah.
Like that was better, like lead off to the happy hour as opposed to the one.
So we are at time. I want to thank our three fabulous panelists. Thank you very much. I'll just say a couple of things, if I can just close the panel out, just some of the main themes that we heard. So I love that we ended on that question, just even thinking about how do we avoid conflations between data integration? What does it mean for broader processes of knowledge generation? So Andrea, I really like kind of what you said around remembering that data is not separate from people itself, that we need to remember that when we are integrating forms of data, we also have to bring the people that come with that, who've created and stewarded that data for a really long time, in order to make sure that we're interpreting, we're contextualizing that knowledge piece that Julie mentioned. Tyler, I really like how you said kind of, you know, you mentioned really upfront this notion of a lower T truth. So what I got from that was thinking about, as we move forward in this process of data integration, remembering that we're dealing, yes, with compounding uncertainties, scalar mismatches, all of those things. But we have to stay true to that science is very incremental, it's very partial, and we're just taking one step at a time further and further. And then Matt, you mentioned a lot of things around kind of the notion of data integration as really challenging. We must be willing to go into spaces that are different and uncomfortable. But we as people that want to see data integration proceed also have to be cultivating those environments if we are going to be successful. And then last, just remembering that data integration is never a panacea. It's normative, but it's also not normative, and we have to be aware of the risks. We have to be willing to understand whose story are we now telling if we're integrating different forms of data, issues of power and positionality that also come attached to that. So lunch is upstairs. Thank you everyone for a fantastic morning, and you're free to eat lunch. Thank you.
Thank you so much.